Thank you for listening to the Conform to Christ podcast, where we seek to engage the mind, affect the heart, and call people to follow Christ. I'm Jay Jones, and I am here with George Mays and special guest, Cory Anderson. Like that intro? Like a pro.
Yeah.
Cory's here with us. We're glad he came in, and he's representing Postmill today. So it's a big responsibility when you represent an entire field of eschatology.
I feel the weight.
So we've had a good time so far. This is number 5, right? We did an intro to eschatology, like what are the non-negotiables, dispensationalism. George did all mill, great job there. Historic pre-mill. Now we got post-mill. So we got them all covered, I think, except for those heretical versions.
Right.
We'll leave those away. Yeah. But before we jump in, I'm looking forward to it. You got anything for us? I suspect you do.
Well, I just found a meme for you.
You found a meme?
Yeah, I just found a meme. It's just a random meme that I found and thought,
Let's see it.
I'll show this to Jay. Jay, you like your snack packs, right?
Oh yeah, snack
Like
packs.
your snack packs.
One of the fine delicacies
I put
of the
the
world.
snack packs in my refrigerator, and you still have not. Have you eaten any of them?
I haven't eaten any
No,
of
I
them.
gotta-
George, I don't want to plunder your goods.
I bought them for you.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
For me.
I thought you were just stocking your fridge with the
No.
snack packs.
But since you went to Master's Seminary, I was wondering if you'd ever seen these. You can put the Mac
Fresca
the
packs.
Mac pack.
Mac pack Frescas?
The Mac pack Fresca.
Made with real milk. I wonder if it tastes like Tres Leches cake. I'd eat that. That's pretty funny.
I didn't know if you'd
Fresca. He likes Fresca,
He does
I guess.
like his Fresca.
He really likes it a lot.
Yeah, he had like a little mini rant during the COVID lockdown stuff because he couldn't get his Fresca.
That's funny. Oh, good stuff.
Well, Johnny Mac.
Yeah, good thing we recorded this series after I graduated, huh?
Right.
Just kidding. No, they knew. They had full knowledge of who they were accepting in.
Steve Lawson
calls
you into his office.
You would have even been welcomed in, George. Had a couple all meals.
Even me?
Even you.
me.
Even you. Yeah.
What is Steve Lawson's?
I would assume he's dispy. Like
I would think he is. Sometimes he says things though that make me believe his historic pre-mill.
okay.
Yeah. But it's not. He kind of is just a guy that's like, I'm only going to preach what's in this particular text, and that's it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to
Go anywhere else.
So it's hard to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So one day you might think he's like an Arminian or something.
Well,
because he's just going to preach what's right there.
I think that's maybe the weakness of some of these guys, that they're known as conference speakers, and so they travel around and they just preach individual text. So they're not a pastor at a church where they're preaching through books of the Bible verse by verse, and so you don't get like the big picture. That's one of the. I was talking to one of our. I was talking to someone a few weeks ago about listening only to Paul Washer.
Yeah.
And if you only listen to Paul Washer, you're just going to be depressed all the time. you're just going to be crushed.
Yeah.
But you have to remember that Paul Washer is not a pastor. He's not at a church preaching to the same people week after week, going through books of the Bible. And so I think that he's assuming that he's preaching to different people every time that he's preaching these sermons.
Mm-hmm.
And so the criticism about him is that he can be really legalistic.
Yeah.
But I think it's because
He can be law heavy.
He's preaching to a particular conference.
Right.
Yeah.
He's not preaching through a book of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so you got to be really careful when you listen to these guys. If all you're listening to are these conference guys, you're not going to get the full counsel of God's word, because that's not what they're doing. They're not not traveling around the country preaching through a book of the Bible. They're just preaching individual text.
Yeah.
And that's what Steve Lawson does also.
Who do you think you need to listen to balance that out?
I think MacArthur's good.
Yeah. No, I mean like a balance out. Like if you're balancing out Paul Washer, you want to tip the teeter-totter back towards more balance. Who do you think is really good in that, as far as that goes?
Piper.
Yeah, that's good.
Piper's
That'd be
a good.
one. Yeah.
Piper would be a good balance, I think.
Yeah. I think so. I think Beaky might be a good one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But people don't listen to him that much. I think
Right.
he'd be a really good one to balance that out.
I don't see his like sermons circulating as much as I see other
Yeah.
guys. He's usually promoting like a book or something.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably.
I think he's got some really good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a pastor also, so he's going to be preaching through
Mm-hmm.
books of the Bible to his people.
Yeah. Yep. Good.
Yeah. So yeah, you have to be careful listening to just a conference speaker.
Yeah.
You got to listen to someone who
Well,
is actually a pastor who's preaching to the same people week after week.
well, before we get into the shenanigans you brought, people probably wondering who this is.
We've talked to Cory before. People know who
Yeah,
you
but
are.
he's
You're
not.
you're like one episode away from
He's
being
like-
a regular.
We get him in like once every like year and a half.
Yeah.
So who are you?
I'm Cory Anderson, pastor at Grace Community Church. Grace Community Church, we actually just changed our church name to Grace Reformed Baptist Church last Sunday,
Okay.
just to be more upfront about who we are.
This is the third time you've changed your name.
Second
Second time, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Second time,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Used to be First Baptist Elgin, right?
Mm-hmm. First Baptist Elgin. Also, not to give a whole defensive when we're changing our name. So we're, Lord willing, we're going to plant another church and launching in September, and working through Constitution and bylaws and Statement of Faith. We've subscribed to the 1689, and church plant was going to do the same thing. And so just to be a little more seamless,
Cool.
they're going to have the same name except they'll be Norman.
Okay.
They're gonna put you up on a big screen.
Are you moving up there? Are you moving to Norman?
No. We've actually been training up 3 other men, and they're in a demonstration phase to be. We'll appoint them as elders the Sunday before they launch. So
Cool.
It's pretty exciting. I mean, so this will be 27 of our members will be going to launch this church in Norman.
Do you have a location?
Yes, we do. It's been incredible. So we were talking to we were just thinking they would rent space, or share space with the church. And I told one of the guys I said, what you need to do is you need to reach out to the DOM for their association, because there'll be Southern Baptists as well, for now.
We'll bring you back in a month and see if that's still
yeah,
still a plan.
Well, I mean, I've heard in the past before, you have the, aging churches who, their congregation has dwindled, and they have all this facility space. And I said, at the very least, they might be willing to share the facility with you, perhaps even at no cost. I said, but man, churches close the doors all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So reach out to them. There might be a church that's getting ready to, close its doors, and, we could purchase the location or whatever. So he reached out to the director of missions, and he was so excited because he said, there's a church. It's on, is it 62 or 63 going into Norman where the big casino is? It's right there on that highway.
I know what you're talking about.
And
Jay frequents there.
Yeah. I go there for golf, George.
But he said the man who's pastoring there right now, he's aging and he's ready to retire, and they just have a handful of members left. You guys can use that space, and if it works out, you get your feet under you, we'll just deed it over to you.
That's,
wow.
That's awesome.
So just the Lord provided in an amazing way. The facilities were built in in the 90s, so they're still pretty new.
Okay.
So it's gonna be really great.
That's
Wow.
great, man.
Yeah, we're
That's good.
excited.
Good stuff.
So, yeah, pastor at Grace Reformed Baptist Church. I have 5 kids, wife of almost 17 years. Yeah,
Well, welcome.
those
Welcome
are
back.
the important things about me.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Glad to be here.
I had to get you on that so I could adjust your microphone volume.
Oh, I see. Yeah,
That's
I'm
my
gonna have to
trick.
remind myself to stay near.
We
The
forgot to do
microphone.
that before we hit record, so I had to get you talking.
Gotcha.
What do you got for us, Giorgio?
Oh, I only have another meme, and it has to do with postmillennialism. So
Let's have it. Let's have it.
So
All right, let's see it.
do you want to see it now, or you want to wait until we introduce what postmillennialism is? People may not even
you
know.
know what?
Not even know what postmillennialism is.
They might not.
That's true.
Let's just go ahead and start, and then maybe you can bring in your funny meme here.
Yeah,
Okay.
bring some levity.
Well, I mean, I thought it was funny.
Let's let Cory have the floor.
Yeah. What
is it?
So I've got a list of questions for you, and we'll just see how the conversation goes.
Okay.
But, so you'd call yourself postmillennial?
Yes.
Postmillennial, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we know I was talking to some church members last night after our prayer meeting about eschatology, and there are a variety of different postmillennial views, right?
Yes.
And we've kind of discovered that as we've been going through our series, that within these major labels, there's different varieties. I mean,
Right.
even Tim Gresham, who came in and talked about dispensationalism, wasn't your typical dispensationalist, right? So given that there are different views of postmillennialism and how it's been expressed, just lay out your position. What is postmillennialism? What makes it post? And then just kind of lay out your view for us.
Okay. So most basically, post-millennialism, post-millennium, millennium, as you guys have talked about, is comes from a word that means 1,000. So the millennium is a 1,000-year period that Revelation 20 speaks about. And the post means that Christ returns post-millennium, after the 1,000 years, whatever that 1,000 years means. So that would be the most simple definition. Christ returns after the 1,000 years that we find in Revelation 20. There are different stripes of postmillennialism. If you're familiar with N. Murray's The Puritan Hope, most of your Puritans who were postmillennialists, not all Puritans were postmillennialists, but those who were typically saw the millennium being a future reality, that the gospel would be preached to the ends of the earth, ushering in this 1,000-year period. Some call it, describe it as a golden age on the earth, where essentially Christ reigns through his people. And that can be described different ways. Most of your Puritans would have you guys talked about idealism, historicism?
A little bit.
Preterism?
Yeah, a little
okay. So most of your Puritans would be, as far as the book of Revelation goes, they would have read it from a historicist point of view, seeing the book of Revelation describing the unfolding of, essentially Christian history.
Right.
From there forward, this is where, if you're familiar with the 1689 and I believe Westminster Confessions, also would refer to the Pope as that Antichrist. So they're seeing fulfillments of these the visions, throughout church history. The historicist view isn't all that common anymore. There are a few scholars, at least that I'm aware of.
I don't want to. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I am interested. Who do you know that holds to historicist view nowadays? Because I agree. You don't see it very much.
The one that I'm most familiar with is Francis Nigel Lee. The only thing I know about him is he's written a commentary on the Book of Revelation from the historicist point of view. There's a website, and it's the name of it. It has to do with Puritan theology, and they take a historicist point of view, but I'm not sure who writes all of their stuff. Could be Francis Nigel Lee or someone related to them. If you're familiar with any of the Presbyterian Covenanters, modern Covenanters, they would call themselves that. I believe there's a decent number of this. It's a small group, of course, but some of them would take a historicist point of view also. More commonly, what you're going to find today, and it was present to some extent with the Puritans. John Owen, for example, would take a preterist view of. I'm not familiar much that he wrote on Revelation, but 2 Peter chapter 3, where you have the earth, stars falling from the sky. A lot of the same language that Jesus uses in Olivet Discourse. Owen read that passage from a at least partial preterist view. So partial preterist meaning that the I can't remember the Latin word, but preterist is seeing the fulfillment of at least most of biblical prophecy in the past. Praetor, that's it. And it simply means past. So personally, I would take a partial preterist reading of Revelation, but not entirely, not comprehensively. I mean, I've listened to both of you guys. I would, see lots of symbolism there, which, most of the views see symbolism there too. But anyway,
for Revelation, where do you take your break for your partial preterism?
I'm not entirely settled on it as of yet. I see a break coming. I would see, obviously the letters that you have at the start of the book, and then you have the heavenly scene in Revelation 4 and 5. I would see the I don't know if we want to call it the tribulation or whatever, starting in Revelation chapter 6 with the Jewish persecution of the Christians, and then you see elements of the Jewish war with the Romans, and I would see that leading all the way up to the end of Revelation 18, where you have the bride, the harlot, judged, and I would see that ultimately being fulfilled in 70 AD. Okay. In Revelation 19, of course, the first verses, you have heaven, praising God for his justice, against Israel. Then you have marriage supper of the Lamb, and then Revelation 19. That was a difficulty for me for a while, going back and forth between, was this Christ coming in judgment on Jerusalem in 70 AD, or is this the return of Christ? And over the last few weeks, I've come to see it more as the return of Christ, and even being a different. So I heard you guys talk about recapitulation last week, and I see recapitulation at a few different points in Revelation, and I would see the last, marriage supper of the Lamb, and Christ coming in judgment. The rider on the white horse in the last part of Revelation 19, being recapitulated in verse 4 of chapter 20, where you have the 24 thrones and those seated there. John sees the souls of those who had been beheaded, and then going into verses 7 through 10, I believe it is, where you have Satan released, and then there being judgment, his destruction thrown into the lake of fire in the last part of that. And so that would be, and I certainly don't think I've said the last word about Revelation 20 or any of these things. But so most of your postmillennialists today, I mean, they'll some of them, there's a man named Martin Selbrady. He takes an idealist approach to the book of Revelation, very similar to B.B. Warfield, who would be a more modern postmillennialist, seeing Revelation, at least most of it, fulfilled in the past in 70 AD, or in first century leading up to 70 AD. And that's where most of your modern postmillennialists are going to be. Whether you're talking about Doug Wilson or Keith Matheson, which I'll mention some of their books later. R.C. Sproul, Kenneth Gentry, who I was listening to him earlier this morning, actually, and I didn't realize that it was 2012. He was saying that he thought his commentary was going to come out soon, and he had been working on it for 10 years before that.
It's not out.
It's not out yet.
That's a dispensational interpretation of soon.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, Kenneth Gentry, he would be one of the more scholarly postmillennial writers. I think his Revelation commentary is supposed to be like 3 volumes or something like that.
I know it's supposed to be at least 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In 2012, he was saying 3, but maybe editors got a hold of it and they're paring him down.
I don't know. Jesus is going to come back before this Revelation commentary is put out, I think. It's been so long.
Yeah. So that's where most of your modern postmillennials are going to be partial preterist, at least partly, seeing the prophecies of Revelation fulfilled in the first century. Part of Revelation 19 at least, or at least Revelation 20 on through the end of the book, they would see still yet future. So I guess in that vein, there's a little bit of futurism in my postmillennialism as well. So
okay, yeah. Well, you you said just a few weeks ago you started seeing it in a different way. So you're still kind of working through stuff also.
Well, especially with the book of Revelation, you know.
So maybe just tie this in. How did you arrive at your current position? Because we've talked about, we grew up pretty much dispensational. That's all we really knew for a long time, and then we just started exploring other positions. Is that kind of similar to you?
Yeah, very similar to you guys. I didn't know it was dispensationalism. Grew up in Southern Baptist Church, Left Behind. I remember watching a movie on a Sunday night, where people vanish, and there was a pretty famous song about.
Yeah, I wish we'd all been ready.
Yeah, that's it. That's
DC,
it. That's
DC
it.
Talk. Yeah.
DC Talk?
Oh, yeah.
Well, no, actually, I'm thinking of an older song.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember. Anyway, so grew up dispensational, really confused on just like, and nobody I could ask questions could really explain things. At least, I don't want to discredit them. They may well have understood, and I just was too confused. So in college, got serious about studying my Bible, and I just wanted to. So I'm just going to read my Bible. I'm going to try to suspend these other things that I've grown up with and just see where I land. And essentially, I landed on what I come to understand was the amillennial position, and that even from there were had friends who were postmillennial and just wanted to really come down. I never really considered historic premillennialism, but would never have said that was my position at any point. But postmillennialism, just going back to look at the text, I wanted to friends recommending authors, and I said I just want to be convinced by texts, and so started working back through, especially in 2020. We were live streaming a briefer version of our services for 6 weeks, and had lots of time on my hands. So ordered some books and got my Bible out, and just trying to work through those passages. I wanted to honestly consider postmillennialism, like I had historic premill and amillennialism, and I had these problem texts, for like 2 Peter chapter 3, it sounds like everything it's really bad and it's destroyed, and of course there are other passages too, and so working through those, in the end of it, in my mind, the postmillennial, or if we want to even just think of it as more of a partial preterist reading of New Testament prophecy, to me made the most sense of the most texts. So that's kind of how I got there. And
you talked a little bit about some authors. Were there major influences and
authors? As far as Keith Matheson was really helpful,
and he's got his biblical theology.
Yeah, from age to age.
Age to age. Is there? Did he write? He wrote something against full preterism, didn't he? Was he the editor of a? Maybe
I'm not familiar with that one.
I think he did, but I could be thinking of someone else. Was that the main book though?
No, actually, the main one was his. He had written it before his biblical theology, and it was Postmillennialism and Eschatology of Hope.
Okay.
It's a little yellow book. It's about 200 pages. If someone wanted a pretty straightforward read, that's there's also different stripes of postmillennialists just with regard to how they see the future. Seeing the millennium as at least beginning in 70 AD, if not before then. What's this future going to look like? Is it a Christian Reconstruction version? With theonomy and implementation of Mosaic Law Code, or is it something else? And I knew that Keith Matheson wasn't a Reconstructionist. I'm not persuaded by Christian Reconstruction. And so I thought he would take a more generic approach to it, which he did. So I would recommend that book to anyone who would want to read it. He works through texts, does that a lot in the book. There's an appendix where he zeroes in on some very specific aspects. So he's working with principles essentially in the first part of the book, and then the appendix he's going to specific texts. Even I've heard you guys mention 2 Thessalonians 8 or 2 Thessalonians 2, and he works through those. It's pretty helpful. Other authors, I have Doug Wilson's commentary, and I've read some of it. As far as wanting to really dig into a text, I didn't find it all that helpful.
And his postmillennialism is a little bit different than what you're describing also, because he would see Revelation 19, the rider on the white horse is the gospel going forth.
Really? I haven't read his part on there. Okay.
Yeah, so he would see Revelation 19 not as a future one-time event of Christ coming, but the spread of the gospel throughout the church age.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So the sword coming from his mouth is the word that slays his enemies in the sense of causing them to be born again, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I've read parts of his.
I was a little disappointed with it, just to be honest. I went into it expecting Doug Wilson. I didn't feel like it was quite his normal style of writing. I didn't find it as helpful either.
Yeah, he has a teaching series, and if you have the Canon app, I know it's on there. I should have thought to look it up. That I thought is better than, and it's not just dealing with Revelation; it's dealing with the postmillennialism in a broader way. I think he talks about historic optimism. He uses that phrase a lot, and so that teaching series I thought was better than the commentary. But Steve Gregg has his commentary, Revelation 4 views, so it's helpful too, because it's the different readings are put in columns. So you're reading the historicist view right next to the futurist, preterist, and idealist.
Yeah.
So,
and there's an updated edition of that that brings in some of the more modern commentaries. That, and I know the first edition didn't have Bill's commentary on Revelation. The updated one does.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's really concise, but I thought it was helpful, especially if you're like not sure where you land, and it deals with each of the views pretty honestly. So
yeah.
It might be helpful. Do you have your all-mill chart still? Do you still have that?
Yes, I do.
Because I think it'd be helpful for people that aren't super familiar.
Right, because correct me if I'm wrong, but are you talking about this age and the age to come?
Yeah, you just kind of like the way your chart was, and then to have Cory explain the differences between all-mill and
because
post-mill.
I think historically all-mill and post-mill have been under the umbrella term of postmillennialism, because we both believe that after the millennium Christ comes. We just describe the millennium in different ways.
Right.
Okay, I've got my chart.
There you go.
This age and the age to come, the overlap of the ages. This is a pretty standard all-mill interpretation of history.
Right.
So what would differentiate post-mill from all-mill?
I mean, one thing to have a post-mill chart like that, it's not going to be all that different, honestly. We would put a point in there for 70 AD just to highlight the significance of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. As I understand it, I think that's when the millennium began.
Okay.
Another difference would be.
And that's a difference from like classical postmillennialism, right?
Right.
Because classical postmillennialism would see it as something in the future from even us,
today.
Right?
That's right.
Would there be like an indicator that the millennium had started in that classical view?
I've heard it talked about in different ways. I mean, it's they talk about it as being ushered in, and even some maybe you don't know that you're in the millennium until
it arrives, and
yeah,
and then all the nations are discipled, and there's this golden age.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a significant event, is that you seeing at least in that view, seeing the spread of the gospel to all nations, where, what would that look like? Christianized governments, I guess, maybe, at least populations, in that view.
But you have in yours, it begins at the destruction of the temple or at the resurrection?
At the destruction of the temple. Now, that doesn't mean that Christ isn't reigning before the destruction of the temple. And that gets into kind of some of the exegesis of Revelation chapter 20. Destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, that marking at least the end of the Jewish age, the Old Covenant age. In my view, and there's differences, of course, I wouldn't see, and this is where I would differ from kind of the classic postmillennialism. I don't see the millennium being an earthly reality. So this would be similar to the amillennial view. What we see in Revelation 20, as I read it, is happening in heaven. 24 thrones, those seated them, those who are beheaded, sees the souls of them, and they reign with Christ for 1,000 years. So these are these are Christians who have passed on, and they are with Christ in heaven. So in some ways, we could think of Christ's reign now as what Revelation 20 would describe as millennial, I guess, in heaven, and perhaps maybe mediatorial as far as the world goes, as human beings are still here. The gospel is being preached. I mean, you have the threefold office of Christ. He's prophet, priest, and king, and that's in his mediatorship. And some of what, in the postmillennial view, I would see some of what he's establishing through his bride, the church, is establishing his mediatorial reign in the earth through the preaching of the gospel and the discipling of the nations.
So what do you see as the main difference between Amil and your interpretation of post-mill? Like the classical post-mill, we can see more of a stark difference. What would you see as what would cause you to be post-mill and not Amil?
In a lot of ways, it would be essentially the pervasive success of the gospel, and seeing the nations discipled. I mean, you have some more modern. Of course, it was early 20th century, but B.B. Warfield. I don't know that I would go as far as B.B. Warfield. He had a position that he called eschatological universalism, in that he believes that, and there are modern scholars too, like Martin Selbrady. They see that when Christ returns, there's no one alive who hasn't been born again. I don't know that I could go that far, but some of that comes from how he reads Revelation 20, which I think his reading's kind of complicated. But I think when Christ returns, looking at Matthew 13, the parable of the wheat and the tares, sometimes folks get it mixed up, thinking that the field is the church, when in fact it's the world. And so when Christ returns, granted it's a parable, but he returns to a wheat field, not a tare field. It's a majority wheat. I mean, we got wheat harvest going on in southwest Oklahoma right now. If you have a field that's full of tares, you don't harvest that. You let it go back in the ground. So
what does that look like? Sorry if it feels like I'm like pushing you on this. I'm just trying to because I've had this question of what does this look like? Like what's it look like for the nations to be discipled? Because I'm thinking about Revelation 20. I mean, you've got Satan bound, then you've got this 1,000 years, and then he's unbound, and there is this rebellion, and so I'm just wondering, what does this millennium look like as the nations are discipled? What exactly do you think that looks like? And when Satan is unbound, I guess you would say he's bound at 80-70. Is that maybe what
yes,
you would...
bound in 80-70. I think
Okay.
I think what we find in Revelation 12 when he's cast down to the earth, this is when he's persecuting the church, wreaking havoc in the first century. You know, it even says, I think, it's there in chapter 12. It highlights the intensity of his fury, and it says, "For he knows his time is short." And so I think that short time is running that span of perhaps from Christ's ascension to 80-70, when I would see him as bound. As far as, what does this future, a world of discipled nations look like? I think it can look different in different places. I would think there's not, as far as if you have civil authorities who are genuine born-again Christians, and they want to govern according to God's Word. Again, I'm not a theonomist, I'm not a Reconstructionist, so we're not bringing Mosaic law code, into government. Though I think there's plenty to learn from there.
But there are post-millennial theonomists, right? And they would see maybe the millennium in a different way than
probably
you would. Okay.
Probably so. I mean, some would see the institution of they'll use the phrase law word of God, as essentially we already have the law. Of course, they're going to see ceremonial aspects are done away with. A lot of them would see the civil law as being one with the moral law. Even the implementation of the penology, the penalties of Mosaic law. Penology. Yeah.
That's a new word.
I think I heard that from, there was a debate. I can't remember if it was one of Greg Bonson's debates or Joel McDermott and the other, I can't remember the other guy's name. They had a debate several years ago on theonomy. So I wouldn't necessarily see it like that. I think there could be Christian monarchies. We've had monarchies that set themselves up as Christian in the past. There could be other more.
I think there'll be a Christian monarchy in the millennium.
In the millennium? Yeah.
Historic pre-mill joke.
Yeah, gotcha. So as far as what does it look like, I'm not really sure. I think now, as far as one of my hangups for a while has been, I think Jay will find this interesting. One of my hangups for a while has been, where do these, you have discipled nations, would say, the population of the earth pervasively, not maybe necessarily entirely, but pervasively born again Christians, then where do these rebels come from?
Right.
Yeah.
Satan returns and Christ has taken the nations. The Father says in Psalm 2, "Ask of me and I'll give you the nations."
Yeah.
And he's given them the nations, and then they turn their backs on Christ and
there's
follow
a big rebellion.
Yeah, and follow Satan.
Are you subscribing now to the John Gill's version of this?
I like John Gill's version, though he's historic pre-mill. There are, so Whitfield, B.B. Warfield would held to a version of that. You guys were talking about Tom Schreiner, I think, last time.
Yeah.
He holds to a version of that. His
New
Creation Millennialism.
I found it last night. New Creation Millennialism.
His view is very similar to what I heard you describing. So I think, if we're just looking at Revelation 20, you've got verse 4. These who were beheaded and did not take the mark of the beast. Verse 4, they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Okay, so this would be one other area that I would differ with. Who am I to differ with, like G.K. Beale? Those who would see that coming to life as, this first resurrection being when you're born again.
Spiritual resurrection,
Yeah, I would see that as
a physical?
I think so. I think the first resurrection, Christ is the first fruits. Also, there's in Matthew 27, there's the really strange passage, or at least I've always thought it was strange. Jesus, there are those who come out of the tombs after Jesus is raised.
Yeah.
I think those are Old Covenant saints, and Bible doesn't tell us what happened. I mean,
What happened to
they
them?
went through the city, but I think they ascended.
Yeah.
Whether at the time Christ did or other time, and then I think Revelation 20 points to also those who are martyred in the first century. I think they're physically resurrected as well. So this first resurrection spanning this time from Christ's ascension, of course, I don't know about other resurrections between Christ's resurrection and this point in 70 AD when the temple's destroyed, but they come to life and reign with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead, so you have this parenthetical statement here in verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. And then it says, this is the first resurrection. So I think you got first part of verse 5 being a parenthesis, pointing to second resurrection at Christ's return. So the first resurrection is with these martyrs from the first century. I mean, like, did you guys talk about N.T. Wright? I can't remember or not, but he talks about
I don't know if we really talked about N.T. Wright any.
anastasis.
Yeah, how
you did.
How it always means
you did.
physical resurrection. Except for he'll say except for in this one spot.
Yeah, in all of Greek literature, New Testament included. So I think those are.
Yeah, that's a weird position for him to land on.
And something else, I think he's great up until that point, you know. But something else that I think is worth considering, this whole idea of first century resurrection, is there's a lot. There's Jesus is the first fruits. We have harvest language with regard to resurrection, and if you go to the book of Numbers, there's essentially two harvests in Old Covenant Israel. You have the barley harvest, which comes. I think it's I'm going to get my feasts mixed up here. Feast of Weeks, when you have first fruits of the barley harvest, and then you have full harvest, and there's another festival. And so I think there may be some parallels between first fruits at Jesus' resurrection and the full harvest, barley harvest, AD 70. And then you have the wheat harvest, which comes after barley, perhaps pointing to second resurrection at Christ's return, which may be where he's getting, some of his imagery in the parable of the wheat and the tares. So the rebels, as Jay pointed to, I think makes the most sense to me. Whether you take a pre-mill position on the millennium or post-mill, where do these rebels come from when that Satan deceives? And I think it makes the most sense. I mean, because you see in verse 5 that the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. So Satan's bound. Then you get to verse 7 when Satan is released, when the 1,000 years are ended. Same phrase. So when the 1,000 years are ended, there are two things that are happening here. Satan is released, and the rest of the dead come to life, verse 5. And so that's those who have believed in Christ and the wicked dead. Pointing to, so then it raises the question of who's Gog and Magog. And you go back to Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. Ezekiel, very difficult book. I still have some questions about Ezekiel. But it points to Gog and Magog. Then it gives the name of some of their princes, Meshech and Tubal. And so I wanted to see, well, does it talk about Meshech and Tubal anywhere else? Because it says that Gog and Magog are going to have these hordes that come with them, and they come against God's people. I think it's talking about the same thing in Ezekiel 39, which this is part of what made me go back to Revelation 19, because it talks about then the birds of the air are going to feast on essentially the carcasses of Gog and Magog army. Comes up in Revelation 19, but going back to Gog and Magog, so Meshech and Tubal, I wanted to see, do these names come up anywhere else? And if you go back to Ezekiel chapter 32, they show up there. This is a prophecy against Egypt, and Ezekiel's telling Egypt that God's going to judge them, and they're going to go down to Sheol. And it says, and it goes to list some other nations, Assyria, Elam, and it says they're there. That those nations are there where Egypt's going. And then it says Meshech and Tubal, they're there. And it talks about the graves. Most of Ezekiel, as I've tried to wrestle that monster, seems to flow pretty chronologically. Maybe until, I have questions about 40 through 48. But if that's the case, then it would seem that when Ezekiel prophesies to Gog and Magog, that they're already in the grave. And that's what chapter 32, verse 6 seems to say. Or verse 26, sorry. So coming before that, you have this prophecy against Egypt. They're going to fall amidst those who are slain by the sword. Egypt is delivered to the sword, drag her away, and all her multitudes. And then the mighty chiefs shall speak of them. This is in verse 21. With their helpers out of the midst of Sheol. They have come down, they lie still, uncircumcised, slain by the sword. Verse 22, Assyria is there, and it talks about its graves. Verse 24, Elam is there, and all her multitudes around her grave. And then Meshech Tubal is there, and all her multitude, her graves all around. And then it lists Edom and some others. And then when you get to verse 30 or chapter 38, it seems that that Ezekiel was prophesying to Gog and Magog. Now, some would say that this battle actually was fulfilled, like in Esther 9, when Haman's still alive and their Jews are being attacked, and that's possible. That could be, or this could be what we find in Revelation 20. Could be a direct fulfillment. I'm not entirely certain. What I am pretty confident of is that these that rebel are those wicked dead that have been resurrected. Satan deceives them. What do they have to lose at that point? There's nothing to lose. And before going to the grave, like we all born in Adam, are totally depraved. At this point, they're utterly depraved. Mm-hmm. They're as wicked as they possibly can be. They hate God, and we would say that people. I think we could say they don't want to be with God.
Right.
They don't want to go to heaven. They don't want to be with the Lord. They hate Him, and they hate all of us. They hate all of His people. So they want to. It's not hard for Satan to deceive them. These nations that he had deceived beforehand, before he was bound, and then he leads them in rebellion again. So that helps solve some of that future question of what does it look like. I don't think the bride, any of the bride rebel against Christ. I think they're the wicked dead. Yeah, I'm sure there's other questions.
Okay. Giving me stuff to think about and go back and look at.
There'll be a lot of pink and purple-haired people in that army. You ever notice that? How these people that rage against Christianity, they always got pink and purple hair?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got a few questions. So people who aren't familiar, I know that we probably already know the answer to this, but for those listening, where does like a rapture fit into your system?
A rapture,
or do you have a rapture at all? You know what I mean?
If by rapture we mean the catching up of the people, I would say that happens there when the 1,000 years is ended, whatever this 1,000 years is. Obviously, I don't think it's a literal 1,000 years because it's been nearly 2,000 since Christ died and rose. Remind me of your question.
The rapture. So not like no secret rapture.
Right, no secret rapture. 1 Thessalonians 4 seems pretty loud. Trumpets and cry of command. So I would see 1 Thessalonians 4 occurring there when the 1,000 years are ended. Christ comes, the dead in Christ rise first. We all go to meet Him in the air. And I think this is where we could see this Revelation 19 perhaps. As I've thought over it the last month or so, trying to shore up my understanding of Revelation, so you have the marriage supper of the Lamb, Revelation 19. So we're caught up with Christ. We come back to the earth, and what are we doing when the hordes of Gog and Magog, when Satan leads them? It could be we're having the marriage supper of the Lamb. we're the beloved city, and they come against us. Of course, Christ slays them with the sword of his mouth, and it's not much of a battle. I used to think of this final battle kind of with Lord of the Rings, Return of the King kind of scenes in my mind. Some of those things, but it's as far as the actual battle goes, it's fairly uneventful. Other than this is something else interesting from Ezekiel 38 and 39. The armies of Gog and Magog there are destroyed by fire that falls from heaven, which is what we see in Revelation 20 as well. So that'd be the rapture. As we the catching up would be 1,000 years are ended, Christ returns,
and we receive like glorious bodies at that point.
I think so. Philippians 3, our bodies will be like His glorious body. It's another thing too with we have resurrection bodies fit for eternal life. The wicked dead do as well. They have resurrected bodies fit for eternal destruction, and could play perhaps into this battle. They're being deceived. So yeah.
All right. How about as far as Israel goes? I know various strains of postmillennialism. I think Ian Murray's postmillennialism, the postmillennialism presented there, it seemed like a lot of the Puritans really wanted to evangelize the Jewish people, and they saw they played a key role in the end of time.
Yeah, Ian Murray talks a lot about that in his book, Puritan Hope. Teases out the arguments of a number of the Puritans with regard to the future hope of Israel. I would agree with him in the sense of I think Romans 11 signals if we want to call it an awakening among the Jewish people. I think that could be another thing that is a signal, of
that it's almost here,
the end approaching. Perhaps I would see Romans 11. I think, in my opinion, is pretty clear on that. I mean, at this point, Israel's just another one of the nations in some ways. They're one of the nations, at least the nations that are to be discipled, from Matthew chapter 28. So I see. I don't know what that awakening, or if we want to call it a revival, what that looks like. But I think we see ethnic Israel, at least a lot of them, come to faith in their Messiah. So
yeah, okay. All right, let's see. What else? How does like Great Tribulation, man of lawlessness, how does this play into postmillennialism? Do you believe at the end there'll be, as far as people who profess to be Christians, that among the Christian community there's going to be a great falling away, a revealing of a man of lawlessness?
No, I think.
Or is this, you see this in a partial preterist type way?
I would see that in a partial preterist type way. 2 Thessalonians 2, man of lawlessness would be an individual, a man in the first century. Many would identify him with Nero. I'm not 100% convinced on Nero. It says whoever this man of lawlessness is going to take his seat in the temple.
Who was the one who tried that? Was it Caligula? Yes. He tried to have his image put in.
Have his image put there. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that this was one of my texts that I had difficulty with, and certainly don't have it all mapped out. I still have questions, but in 2 Thessalonians 2, I mean, you have this language similar to the opening of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 3. These things will soon take place. Have this language. And I mean, to first century church, these things were soon to take place. If someone agrees with me that I think the whole Bible was finished before AD 70, and I know there's lots of arguments against that. But if John's writing this in the 60s, the book of Revelation is very soon to take place. But in 2 Thessalonians 2, you have this. He's writing to the Thessalonians, and so to my mind, this has to be relevant to them. Let no no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless this judgment that Paul's talking about. That day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God. I've read some arguments talking that this could be the high priest, or it could be the Jewish priesthood. I think that's possible. But going on after,
do you think some historicists would see that as maybe the Pope?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that's probably the view of the framers of the Westminster and the 1689 Confession, when they're saying, it doesn't say the Antichrist, but it refers to the Pope as that Antichrist.
Okay.
So I think that could fit with what you find in 1 John. You've heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. And so, yeah, that they would see that because they see the book of Revelation, unfolding, throughout Christian history. That'd be where they go. But verse 6 says, and he's writing to first century Thessalonians, and you know what is restraining him now, so that he may be revealed in his time, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains it will do so until he is out of the way. So I take very seriously that language of now and already, much like I do in the book of Revelation. I can't if now can mean a long time from now, or soon can mean a long time from now. Well, up can mean down, and it's the opposite of what the word actually means. And I know what's the phrase I've read that they're being used in a prophetic sense, or a prophetic future
Right.
sense, or something like that. And I'm just personally not persuaded.
What about like tribulation? Do you see that as the period to which the church has to endure and persevere through from Christ's resurrection till his coming, or do you see that as like mainly fulfilled in AD 70?
I would see the great tribulation as it's talked about in the book of Revelation, primarily happening in the first century, and most of that coming at the hands of the Jews persecuting. That's mostly who persecuted Christians in the first century, was Jews and not Romans. Now you get persecution. Nero was the first Roman emperor to persecute Christians. He comes in the first century, but that's a much shorter span of time than the Jews were persecuting Christians.
Because he started that persecution and then he died like 4 years later or something.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't very long.
That's right.
Or committed suicide. Didn't die.
I mean, he died from suicide.
Right. Well, but there's a distinction, right?
Mhm.
Right.
Crazy. He's a crazy guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would see, there's the question of, and it's not an easy one to answer. Every position has its weaknesses, and one in the minds of some with regard to postmillennialism is Paul in his letters, Peter in his letters seems to indicate that the church is going to be in tribulation until Christ returns. And I would say, yeah, in a sense, there's going to be suffering for Christians until Christ returns. I don't know that it's always going to look like persecution necessarily, because we do have to remember that these letters are written to churches and people in the first century. They're written to them and for them, but and for us, but not to us in the same way as for them. So that's where you even get, I believe Satan's bound. And I had a church member ask me the other day.
That's what I was getting ready to ask you.
Yeah.
That was my next question. What does that mean in your...
Yeah. Well, 1 Peter 5:8, Cory, the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And I would say in one sense, for the people in the first century, that was a real reality. Looking at Revelation 12, he's going out in hot fury against the Christians. I would say it's somewhat difficult to, at least in my mind, to describe what it means that Satan is bound. You have texts like Colossians chapter 2, where our sin debt is nailed to the cross, and it says that Christ triumphed over the powers and the principalities, that he triumphs over them. You have Matthew 12, where Jesus talks about the binding of binding the strong man. So there's some sense in which of the binding that comes in the coming of Jesus. There's other texts that you have the chain in Revelation chapter 20, and Satan's locked away in the pit, and it's sealed over him. And he has this chain. I have no idea what this chain is. This is spiritual realm.
So is it more like all millennial binding? Same type of
it would be like that. I would probably in some ways see the binding as somewhat more. I would see Satan as less free than what I've heard a lot of amillennialists would think of. However, he's in the abyss. He's in the bottomless pit. This is obviously not in this physical realm. So is that symbolical, or is that an actual place like hell? And his binding is, I've heard it described, it's more like rather than him being totally inactive, which some would take that view. I would say he's more like a mob boss in a maximum security prison, calling shots from the inside. I don't think we have any indication that he can't communicate.
He's like Kingpin.
Yeah, he's like Kingpin.
Kingpin. That sounds familiar.
That's from Marvel is Daredevil.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with that one. But
did they have Daredevil when you were a kid, or is he new? You don't know about Daredevil? It was just Superman and Batman back in the day. Flash Gordon. Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, as far as Flash Gordon, the 80s movie, did you see that?
I haven't seen it.
Oh, you have to look that up. The theme song was really, I really enjoyed it when I was a kid. Anyway, see what that binding exactly is and what it entails. Revelation 20 says that Satan is bound from deceiving the nations, and I don't think that only includes deceiving the nations with regard to the gospel. Some of what Satan's done in deceiving the nations is what he does in Revelation chapter 20. He deceives the nations to go and make war. He's deceived nations to make war. He did that for centuries, manipulating world powers, manipulating kings, world governments, and I think his minions, demonic forces, however we want to think about demons or whatever these fallen celestial beings are, they still do the same thing today,
right.
Seeking to thwart the gospel and destroy mankind.
All right. Yeah. I only have one more question. Do you have any, George?
Well, I was just going to ask, what are the major passages that you would appeal to? You mentioned some problem passages that you have to work through. What are some of the major passages that you would appeal to?
I would appeal. I would go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, where in all of the Mosaic or the Abrahamic promises that God makes, kings are going to come from him, and his seed is going to be a blessing to the nations. So Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Genesis 22, where he's making these promises to Abraham and by extension to his seed, who ultimately is Christ. And we, if we're of faith in Christ, we are Abraham's seed. So those would be some of the first. Genesis 49, Jacob's blessing to his sons, which some of those don't really sound like blessings. But to Judah, the promise that there is that the tribute is going to come from the peoples to this one who will sit on from whom the scepter won't depart. Going from there, go pretty quickly to the Psalms. I think there's some typological things that we could even look at in the conquest of the land in Joshua, who's Yeshua, essentially in Hebrew the same name as Jesus. They're taking full conquest of the land. So I think there could be some typological fulfillment happening there that would point to my view of the success of the gospel and Christ. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about we need to take dominion, and I want to nuance that to a bit to say dominion's given to Christ, and we are His bride, so we are His helpmate. In that we're working, by His Spirit. He is with us, preaching the gospel, and it's. I think it's more right to say that Christ is taking dominion of the world, of the nations. So Psalm 2, mentioned that earlier. The Father promises the Son the nations, and then the kings and rulers of the earth are commanded to kiss the Son, lest he perish, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. Psalm 110, one of the most quoted Old Testament passages in the New Testament, talks about all of the Messiah's enemies will be put under His feet. Psalm 67 or 72, verse 8, talks about He shall have dominion over the earth. Isaiah 2, I know from a historic premill perspective, they would see that fitting, after the return of Christ. I think there can be a reading of a prior to Christ, there being a fulfillment of that. Daniel chapter 2, you have this statue that it represents the kingdoms of the earth, from the Persians and the Greeks. We have Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, and then the Roman part of the statue it's clay and iron, and the little stone strikes it and it falls apart, and then the stone grows and fills the earth and becomes a mountain, pointing to Christ, I believe. A few other passages in Daniel. Matthew, the Olivet Discourse, I think, is helpful to see as maybe not necessarily all of the Olivet Discourse. There's a break there where I think can point to the return of Christ, but most of chapter 24 pointing to first century fulfillment. That generation that Jesus was speaking to, I believe, saw most of the prophecy that Jesus gave there. Matthew 28, just the command to disciple the nations. Was it Augustine said that God command what you will and grant what you command? I think this happens with the Great Commission. He commands us to disciple the nations, and He grants what He commands. Some of those problem passages, like 2 Thessalonians 8, 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, where it's talking about some of these, chapter 4, the return of Christ, judgment. It talks about some in 1 Thessalonians 5 as well as 2 Thessalonians 1 and 2. Some of that can be somewhat difficult to harmonize. So still have some questions there. Another problem passage for me was 2 Peter 3, which I mentioned earlier. You have stars falling from the sky, but that's language that's used fairly often in the Old Testament. Joel 2, some other places that was talking about, I think Joel 2 talking about was fulfilled in the first century AD, but we're still here and the earth's not destroyed. It hasn't been burned up. So they think this is symbolic, prophetic language to describe the world being changed. Much like, you have prophecies against Israel in the Old Testament, and some of that same language, the earth melts and, earthquakes and all of these things. And it sounds like things are destroyed. And for them, the world as they knew it was destroyed, in the sense of it was never the same. So those are some of the passages. I think a big one for me was what I'd see as a plain reading of 1 Corinthians 15. It says that all of Christ's enemies will be put under His feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. And that's and then He hands the kingdom, hands His kingdom over to the Father. So those are a lot of Old Testament passages. I think there are some that are helpful in the New Testament as well.
I noticed you didn't mention any Zechariah. You can't settle on an eschatology unless you deal with Zechariah first. I've
studied some Zechariah 1 through 6. I would have to call that up from the depths of my memory. It's been a while. But Zechariah 14, I know, is often posed as a problem passage.
Right.
I have a friend who's historic pre-mill. That's actually a friend of a friend, just an acquaintance of mine who lives in Fort Worth, and that's one text that he uses to push pretty hard for a historic pre-mill position. So
Which text?
Zechariah 14. Yeah. And I can totally see it. It's like that's tough. That's hard.
Well, John MacArthur says it's really simple.
Yeah,
It's really simple.
of course it is.
It's really clear. It's really clear.
Simple to John MacArthur.
Yep.
Which
Maybe when we're done, hopefully being pastors for 50 years, then we can say it's simple, guys.
Yeah, maybe.
Don't you see it?
I may disagree with his interpretation of it, but I have no doubt it's simple to him.
Yeah.
That's
right. That's right.
Well, my last question was, how does your view of eschatology? Do you see that it's helped you to become a better Christian or sanctify you in some ways?
Yeah, I think so. For one, I mean, I think it communicates to us just because I believe it may be thousands of years before Christ returns, which means what we do now matters for the future, not just in the not just to be as fruitful as we can be, in our own lives and in our own ministries, making disciples. We want to do that, but we want to do so in the way that we teach, in the way that we raise our families and make disciples in the church. We want to think generationally. That you have in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Promises within the Ten Commandments that God shows his faithfulness to thousands of generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. And I'm not a Presbyterian, but there are blessings that our children enjoy by being raised in a Christian home and raised in faithful churches. That I believe the Lord's faithful to those who give themselves to making disciples of their children. And hopefully having an impact on their grandchildren and going forward. That in a lot of ways, I think this is the way the Great Commission's fulfilled, in an organic way of pastors preaching faithfully and expecting there to be fruit from his preaching long after he's gone, because of the disciples that he's at least participated in making. But I think it should impact how we approach life, in the social realm as well. We want laws in our state and our nations that are just, and we have a standard for what's just, and it's God's word. And we should consider ourselves, or at least put it before the people in our churches and our Christian friends and acquaintances, that there are some who would be suited to be a faithful legislator, and if a man is suited for that, I think it's worth considering. Lord, is this something you'd have me do? Even temporarily, for the sake of the good of our land, the good of our neighbors, but also for the fruitful preaching of the gospel. And Paul tells Timothy to instruct the church in 1 Timothy 2 to pray for rulers, that we might live a peaceful and quiet life. Doing what? Making disciples. And living faithfully, and in our work. If you're a Christian plumber, you should do some plumbing, didn't you? I just remembered that when I said that.
What are you talking about?
Yeah,
try to keep that a secret, buddy. All right, people. I'm gonna start getting phone calls here in about the next couple hours after this airs.
We don't get any comments on our stuff.
Maybe it was another. Maybe I'm confusing you with someone else. Whether you work in an assembly line, manufacturing cars, you should do it to the glory of God. If you're a school teacher, then you should be a light to your students and to your coworkers. If you build homes, then you should want to build a home for someone that's going to last a long, long time, not something that they're going to have to start replacing things on, in the very near future. So some of those things, I mean, just in thinking about that, but I think there's something, and of course, I know no Christian wants to just be glum and dour, and I think my view of the future, because it's the world. If someone thinks, why Paul is brash on a sinking ship? No, I don't think any Christian wants to really be pessimistic. I think we all want to be optimistic. If nothing else, just that we have eternal life and Christ wins. But just being more optimistic and hopeful for the world, it's been good for my soul. Especially coming to these views more so in 2020, it was a joyful thing for me, and I think it was because I was sharing these things with my wife at the time and continued to. It had much the same effect for her as well. So
awesome.
You got any more resources that you would recommend?
Yeah. I mean, there's the Keith Matheson book, Postmillennialism and Eschatology of Hope. His biblical theology is it's from age to age, the unfolding of biblical eschatology. It's not going to answer all of your questions, but he walks through the whole Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, and he's not being overtly postmillennial or anything. He's not trying to hide it, but that's his perspective, is that he has, this historically optimistic view. But I think he does a good job for the most part. In Murray's book, The Puritan Hope, it's kind of thick, but it's a good read. It's a lot of fun. Steve Gregg's, I would recommend this to anyone, whether you're unsettled on your position on your eschatology, or even just specifically the millennium. It's a helpful book. I mean, you have the four primary hermeneutics for reading the book of Revelation right there next to each other. They're succinct. So that's Steve Gregg. That's two G's at the end. Revelation, 4 views. And then there's this other book that I've only started reading that it's not just for postmillennialism, but it's Crawford Gribben, who he's a Scottish scholar, historian, and it's Evangelical Millennialism in the Transatlantic World, 1500 to 2000. He's just tracing out the development, the changes in the positions of eschatology. I think this one thing that's really helpful is that he points out that we need to be careful about taking terminology, even like postmillennialism, amillennialism, premillennialism, and applying it before anyone was actually using those terms. We don't want to use them anachronistically, because, as he points out, historically, not everyone's fit just nice, neat, and tidy into one of those positions. The one thing I will say about this book is you have to watch for it to go on sale. I think it's $130.
Whoa!
But I caught it on sale for $25.
That's
a good sale.
Yeah, that is a good sale.
Yeah, it's one of those academic books that has such a narrow readership.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think it's on Kindle, and you might be able to find it cheaper on Kindle. So,
wow.
So those are some.
Okay. Well, I've got my post-mill meme for you guys, so you can
Let's see it.
Throw that up on the screen. There you go. Post-mill boys be like.
Yeah,
That's the Elon Musk post-millennialism.
It needs to be Mars.
Go out and that's right.
Yeah, well, technically, there would be nations too.
That's
so.
right.
We haven't gone back though, huh? When are we going back?
I don't know.
When are we going back to the moon?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yes, think we went to the moon.
Maybe we went. Maybe we went.
Corey's asking. Corey's asking the real questions.
Did we go? Did we go? And they're like, and then they discovered this is where Satan's bound. We're out of here. Get out of here before we break him out.
Oh, man.
Corey, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. It
It's
was
my
good.
pleasure. Hope it was helpful.
You want to do the honors, George?
No, I don't want to do the honors.
Come on
You
now.
do the-
Come on. Come on now, George.
All right. The things I do for you, Jay.
There
I
you
never
go.
get any thanks either.
I cued the music.
I never get any thanks from you either. Well, Corey, thanks for coming on and talking about postmillennialism. Hopefully it's been helpful for you. If it has, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Get the word out. And what's coming up next, Jay? We
No
have
idea.
no idea what's coming up next. So
Yeah.
just stay tuned. You'll be as surprised as we are. All right. So we will see you next time. Hopefully you have a good remainder of your week. Have a blessed weekend. Have a great Lord's Day, and we will see you next time. God bless.